So I know that some people have this picture-perfect childhood where it's like you see in the movies, where it's full of imagination and adventure and excitement. But that's not my story. Those things existed in my childhood, but they were few and far between. See, growing up for me was rough, right? I mean, my parents were addicted to drugs and alcohol, mostly my dad. And so, to be honest with you, that meant that a lot of chaos was in my childhood. There was a lot of violence. I mean, if I can describe my childhood in one word, I would say just very chaotic. It was like a roller coaster ride. You really didn't know what you were walking into. You didn't know how the weekends were going to be. It was just full of ups and downs and really chaos. But when I was around 7 or 8, a change really started to happen in my family. It started with the move. We were living in Connecticut, where I'm from, and then my parents decided that we were moving to North Carolina. Now, if you know anything about North Carolina, you know that it's like the belt buckle of the Bible Belt, right? Like it's like the place where there's a church in every corner and everyone goes to church. And so within about a year, my mom was exposed to the gospel and Jesus, and God really just changed their life. And I remember as a kid seeing the change in my mom's life, and it was very evident. It was very obvious that God had changed her life. But as a kid, I really didn't understand it exactly. But my dad, I remember during this time, just went the opposite way. He was like, he wanted nothing to do with religion and that type of stuff. And really his addiction got even worse. And I remember living in North Carolina and just the cops being there at the house pretty much every weekend. That's a bit of an exaggeration, but they were there really a lot. And it just got really bad for my dad. And so my parents ended up separating after a few years of living in North Carolina. My mom just couldn't do it anymore. And so that was hard, right? I didn't know if I was really ever going to be a part of my dad's life again. And so that was really hard. But I would say around 11 or 12, my dad hit a rock bottom. And during this time, my mom and him were actually trying to really try to work things out and figure out if they could actually be married again and be together. And my dad decided that he needed to go to rehab. Now, I remember him going to rehab. That was not a new story. I mean, he had been to rehab in Connecticut. He had been to multiple rehabs. And so as a kid, I'm like, okay, my dad's going back to rehab, like whatever, right? But he went back to rehab. But the difference was this rehab was a Christian rehab. And he went off to rehab I was around 11 or 12. And within 2 weeks, I'll never forget getting the letter. He wrote home explaining that God had changed his life. And as a son, I was pumped because I saw the change in my mom's life. So I was like, man, this is great. Like, God changed your life. Like, awesome. And so my dad got out of rehab. And I remember when he got out of rehab, it was interesting because he just, like, it was so different. It was like a different person. My parents actually started going to church together. Like that was crazy. And they started bringing us together. And I remember during this time, like, my family was normal. Like, there were some, like, they were finally kind of normal. And so I was really excited. My parents were going to church. We were doing kind of normal things as a family. And during this time, it was hard because I wanted to grab hold of the God thing and be like, my parents are saved. I want to be a Christian now. And I remember trying really hard to do that, but I just couldn't. See, for me, I couldn't figure out how God could love me because of everything I'd seen when I was younger and everything that had happened. Like God, like, look, he didn't love me, right? Like, he might love them, but just not me. I couldn't convince myself. And so there was this disconnect. And I decided, like, look, I want nothing to do with God. Like, I just don't. Like, I want nothing to do with him. And so I started kind of doing my own thing. And I started getting in trouble. I remember in middle school. But it was when I got to high school where it really went downhill for me. I remember around freshman, sophomore year, I had this girlfriend and we broke up, and it was really hard. It was really hard because when we broke up, it really brought up just a lot of pain that my childhood had. And so, like, all this stuff starts coming to the surface that I hadn't felt in years, and I didn't know what to do with it. But I looked at my older brothers, and they were drinking and drugging, and they were the life of the party in high school. And so I really did what I had been taught to do. I turned to drugs and alcohol. And I remember I started going to parties with my older brothers, and then one day I was at school. I was at lunch, and one of my friends, his dad had cancer, so he was taking his prescription medicine, and he had the medication with him. And I'm like, again, I'm down and out. Like I'm going through a lot of stuff. I'm lonely. I'm feeling a lot of the things I felt from childhood. I'm confused about life. I just really don't know what to do. And my friend says, look, just take some of these pills. And so I took them, and I loved it. It was like the best thing I'd ever experienced in my life. And it started a really bad drug addiction in my life. And it was almost immediately that I was like all in. Like I'm going to do drugs. Like this is what I'm going to do. And I became heavily addicted to prescription medicine, mostly opiates, drugs like hydrocodone, oxycodone. I was later introduced to Oxycontin, and that kind of led really to my downfall. But the next 3 years of my life, they were just really a blur. I don't really remember much of those next 3 years. I just became a full-blown drug addict. It got so bad that I had to start stealing to pay for my addiction. Like I couldn't make money to pay for it anymore. So I started stealing from family and friends and taking things and selling it off. And so that really led to my rock bottom. When I was around 18 years old, I remember really these few months that really caused my rock bottom. I was stealing a lot to pay for the drugs that I was using, drugs like Oxycontin, and I was doing other drugs too. I always said that I never discriminated when it came to drugs. I would do it if it was in front of me. I did cocaine sometimes on the weekends if it was there. I mean, I really didn't care. I drank a lot. I always made sure I had a fifth of liquor in my bedroom because if I didn't have any drugs, I needed something, right? I was just trying so hard to really fulfill and numb that thing inside of me, and that really, when I was 18, really led to a lot of craziness. I'll never forget this one night. I was with my friend. That we were like boys, and we kind of started doing drugs together, and we had forged a few $100s worth of checks, and we went and bought a bunch of drugs. And we're in his Mustang, and we're driving to downtown Charlotte. We were going to some college parties. I was still living in North Carolina at the time. And so here I am. I have all these drugs really in my lap, right? I have cocaine, some bag of like Roxy's, and some pot and some alcohol on my feet. I got all this stuff. And I remember looking at him and saying like, look, like tonight we're going to live like rock stars. Like, because to us, this is what we live for. Like nights like night with all these drugs and all this stuff that we had. And we're going to hang out with these girls. Like it's going to be absolutely great. And the night was great. We went to these college parties. We ended up bringing some girls back to his house. And long story short, we got kicked out of his house because his mom didn't like the fact that we brought drugs and girls home. And I remember walking down the road about 3 o'clock in the morning, and my sister came and picked me up, and she brought me home. And I remember getting in bed that night. I was doped out of my mind. I couldn't sleep, and I'm tossing and turning. And I remember looking up at the ceiling. And I remember saying, is this all there is to life? Because for the first time in years, the drugs stopped numbing that thing. And they were no longer fulfilling me. And no matter how much drugs I did that night, it just, like, there was still something off. There was something just wrong. And you would think that you'd be like, oh yeah, that would tell you, stop doing drugs, Kody, right? But for an addict, it doesn't work like that. It just got worse. And I started doing drugs even more, stealing more, and it really led really to a set of circumstances that really caused me to look in the mirror and try to figure things out. See, what happened was my best friend that I did drugs with that night went out of town, and so someone else and I, we decided that we were gonna break into their house. I was really like family to this family. I knew their garage code, so I gave the garage code. I was there. I was the driver. The other person went in, grabbed all his jewelry, and came out. And And then we went and sold it at the local pawn shop that we'd been selling things. And to be honest, within, I would say a few hours, or probably 24 hours, we were caught red-handed. Everyone knew it was us. They saw the truck I was driving. It was really a disaster. And I remember I'm sitting on my kitchen table. I'm crushing up a pill. I snort it, and when I look up, there's a car driving up my driveway, and I'm like, "Who's this?" And I go walk out, and it's a detective, and he sits me down at my kitchen table, and he says, "Son, I don't think you realize it, but you're looking at like 5 years in prison." And when he said that, it was like the reality hit me for the first time in years. And the next day I go to work, I come home, and I'm just broken. I'm like, I can't believe this. Like, I've destroyed my life. I'm a drug addict. I'm an alcoholic. I'm a thief. I'm a liar. And I couldn't believe who I became. And so I remember I went into my dad's room, and I called him in there, and I remember looking at him and saying, "Dad, I need help. I'm gonna die, or I'm gonna go to jail, because I'm a drug addict, and I don't know how to stop." See, up until that point, my parents knew I was doing drugs, but I had never admitted it. And I remember looking at my dad, and it was like in this moment we realized something, that I became exactly who my dad used to be. And so my dad called the same rehab he went to. And by that weekend, I was off to rehab at age 18. I had lost my friends, everything. And it was the darkest moment in my life. And the reason why I really didn't want to go to this particular rehab was because it was a Christian rehab. Again, I didn't want anything to do with God. Now, I had done things that would just, God would never want to love me, right? I had done a lot of bad things now. So not only have I just been through a lot of bad stuff, I had now done a lot of bad things. And I was just a terrible person. And so I couldn't reconcile that in my mind, but I went to this rehab because I really didn't have a choice, right? And I'll never forget this older black lady. She walked up to me when I got there, and she said, "Kody, I just want you to know that God loves you." And I was like, "What?" like you don't know me, lady. Like that's cute, but like you don't know the things I've done, the things I've been through. And so the next few days that really messed with me. And I remember just being like, what in the world? Like, God loves me? And the third night in rehab, we went to an AA meeting. I came home. I'm tossing and turning, and for the first time in years, I really started to pray. And I don't really remember exactly everything I said that night, but I remember saying to God, "God, I can't do this anymore. I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired. I'm tired. I'm exhausted. And I don't know what to do. And so if you're really real, if you really do love me, then please help me, because I don't want to be like this anymore." And I'm telling you, in that moment, like a switch went off in me. Like I knew that God in that moment, He loved me and He had just changed my life. I remember looking outside the window, and for the first time in my life, I could like see clearly. And I'm not blind, right? Like something happened in that moment. God had changed my life. And I remember a few weeks later, I'm calling home, I'm telling my parents, like, look, like God, I'm saved, like God changed my life. And I remember reading the Bible after a few weeks. I'm still in rehab. And I'm reading and I'm like, God, I feel like God's calling me to preach. I feel like He's telling me that. Now God had never really spoken to me, so I'm like, that's weird. Like I don't know what that just was, but like I don't want anything to do with it. Like I'm not gonna preach. Like, are you kidding me? But I remember saying, if God wants me to preach, He'll tell me, right? He'll tell me. And so I get up to give my testimony at graduation at the rehab, and I finish my testimony. I sit back down, and the person hosting the graduation looks at me in front of all these people and says, "Son, you're being called to preach, and you probably don't even realize it." And I'm like what? Like, yeah, actually I do. God actually told me that, but it was weird because I told Him to tell me, and then like you just did. So it was crazy, and I couldn't believe it. But that was the beginning of really my journey into ministry. And over the next few years, I remember that same year, I graduated rehab in May of 2009, and then I went off to Bible college, and October of 2009. God had just really completely changed my life. And it was, I later on, after a few years, I got into ministry and really started preaching and really doing what God had called me to do. But over time, I felt this calling to move back to New England. New England had always been my home, and I'd always say I was going to move back, but I realized after having a conversation with my dad, almost a few months after becoming a Christian, that there's just not a lot of churches in New England. I mean, there's churches, but they're not full, they're not thriving. It's not like it is in North Carolina. And so over time, God called me back to New England to plant a church, and I knew He was calling me back. So in 2014, I moved back to New England to plant a church, and I've fallen in love with the city of Gloucester, and so I currently live here with my wife, and we're pouring the gospel into this city, right? We are loving this city to the best of our ability because I believe God has called me to plant a church here. I can imagine a church that really means come as you are, right? Like that not just says that, but really means like come as you are. That really helps messy people really get their life back together. That really allows people to experience the love of God. Because at the end of the day, that's my story. Like that's all I've ever known as a Christian. And so I want to bring that to a group of people that are extremely broken here in Gloucester. And I want to see God do an amazing work, and we believe that He's going to. I really can't wait to see what God is going to do over these next years and how He's going to use really the story that He's given me. Because I've noticed pretty clearly that God's hand's always been on my life. And even if I look back at my childhood and everything, all that was part of God's plan, because He is going to do really some great things with that. And I can't wait to really experience it, to be honest with you.